Hey everybody, this is a piece by a Christian Palloix titled The Labor Process from Fordism to Neo-Fordism. It's translated by John Mepham, or Mepham, I don't know, it's probably Mepham, and Mike Zoneuscher. Anyway, here we go. Introduction. The analysis of the historical development of the labor process and of the complex forms of the labor process's current organization, as well as any attempt to foresee possible future developments or devise alternative scenarios for the future, presuppose an initial definition of the labor process as well as an account of the labor process's position within the productive system and the movement of capital. A. Definition. The labor process may be defined as that process by which raw materials or other inputs are transformed into products having a use value. The labor process may be defined as that process by which raw materials or other inputs are transformed into products having a use value. This process is a combination of three elements: human activity or labor, which is set to work as labor power, the object, raw materials, unfinished products, etc., upon which the labor acts, the means in general, usually in the form of tools or ever more complex machinery by which labor acts. B. Position of the labor process. The history of the labor process is bound up with both the development of the productive system, or modes of organization and of production, and of the movement of capital, movement of accumulation and movement of valorization of capital, and also with the rise of forms of division of labor, whether within the collectivity of workers, simple labor / complex labor, division of labor as different kinds of activity, etc., or within social relations, mental labor / manual labor, etc., The first thing to get clear is that we can only understand the labor process if we understand the relationship between the productive system and the movement of capital. By productive system, we mean the ways in which the production of use values and commodities is organized. This organization takes place in the context of forces and relations of production, which are considered as divided into categories in two different ways. First, into the different departments of production, and secondly, into the different branches of industry. The production system is the material translation in the labor process of the exigencies of the movement of capital. The analysis of the movement of capital shows that this is in fact a movement which has two aspects, which correspond to the two ways of dividing up the productive system, departments / branches, This dual movement can be seen in the process of valorization of capital and the process of accumulation of capital. Included in the notion of valorization of capital is the effect of the requirement of profitability, both in the combination and organization of the elements constituting each individual capital, and also in the conduct of the movement of realization of these individual capitals. Valorization designates the conditions of productive effectiveness and of profitability of those capitals engaged in the various branches of the productive system. The notion of the accumulation of capital refers to the requirements placed upon the conditions of production by virtue of the fact that the conditions of production must issue in a surplus product, requirements which are expressed in the fact that capital must be used to produce new conditions, intensive or extensive, of production of surplus. The accumulation of capital is what is involved when we are discussing the conditions of productivity. The valorization of capital corresponds to a division of the productive system into branches of industry producing, commodities. The valorization of capital corresponds to a division of the productive system into branches of industry producing, commodities. The accumulation of capital corresponds to a division of the productive system into departments of production producing, goods, production goods, consumption goods, from the point of view of the formation of surplus product. The production of the surplus product, like the production of commodities, combines the processes of accumulation and valorization with the labor process. According to the emphasis, whether on accumulation or valorization, so one or other aspect of the labor process will be emphasized. The labor process occupies a central position in relation both to the productive system and to the movement of capital, with which it is both tightly bound up and which it serves to define. The productive system and the movement of capital are deliberately directed towards the labor process, which is the real, quote, heart, end quote, of the economy, and hence towards the constitutive elements of this process and their particular forms of combination. All forms of surplus product presuppose both a certain combination of elements of the labor process and their integration into the productive system and the movement of capital. For example, any production of surplus in extensive form involves a labor process characterized by a prolongation of working time devoted to production, extension of the duration of working time, increase in the intensity of work, which has consequences for both the structure of the productive system and the movement of capital. Similarly, production of surplus in intensive form implies a labor process characterized by increases in the productivity of labor, with ensuing important modifications in the productive system and the movement of capital. Evidence of this is apparent from any labor process founded upon the principle of automation. As it is the, quote, heart, end quote, of the economy, the labor process's involvement with the productive system and the movement of capital is not isolated from the totality of social relations. The labor process's own development is a necessary corollary to the division of labor in the capitalist system. The labor process's own development is a necessary corollary to the division of labor in the capitalist system. Adam Smith's famous example of the manufacture of pins underlines the capitalist necessity for the principle of the division of labor and the fragmentation of tasks within capitalist production. The principle of specialization within the capitalist system, however, has been extended to all social activities, giving rise to a social division of labor, and notably a division into branches of the productive system in which specific, concrete labor processes differ from one another. The combination of specialization in the production of commodities and the social division of labor into industrial branches producing different commodities and involving different labor processes gives rise to a, quote, separation, end quote, more social than economic, end of complex labor from simple labor. Second, there's a footnote here, looks like. 1 second. There's 2 footnotes that I missed, or 1 footnote that I missed. The author is grateful to the help in preparing the text from B. Coyot, J. Perrin, and R. Tibergine. And the next footnote says, C. Remor Tortajada, les réductions du travail complexe et travail simple. Anyway. End footnote. This separation becomes the basis of a hierarchy of labor within the labor process, and hence of a hierarchy of wages, and also the foundation of the hierarchical principle within the enterprise, i.e. the foundation of the labor process itself. The growing differentiation of social strata and the formation of classes is a function of the development of the division of labor. The existence of differentiated social classes presupposes a clearly defined division of labor, a division of labor articulated upon the labor process in the case of the capitalist system. Furthermore, the integration of the labor process into the logic of the capitalist system requires not only a division of labor in productive activity as well as a social division of labor, but also a division of labor in social relations involving the separation of mental and manual labor, which complements and supports the separation of simple and complex labor, with important effects on the training and dequalification of workers. Quote, mental and manual labor in the technological division of labor are subject to the same general law of extraction of maximum surplus labor from the maximum number of individual labor powers, but the same law produces contradictory effects upon mental and manual labor, whereas it seeks to produce the maximum dequalification of the maximum proportion of manual laborers. It seeks to produce the maximum skill in the smallest possible proportion of mental laborers, end quote. Why Megnin? I don't know if I'm saying that right. End quote. New section. The historical development of the labor process. A certain number of phases linked to specific forms of the production of surplus have punctuated the development of the labor process. Cooperation, manufacture, machinery, and the factory, whose appearance led to Taylorism and Fordism and automation. Where am I? And automation, which today constitutes the point of departure for possible developments of the labor process within contemporary capitalism. But it would be misleading to describe the development of the labor process apart from the labor process's relation to the forms of production of surplus product in either extensive or intensive accumulation. Section 1.1, the labor process and the production of surplus product. Two specific forms of surplus product have appeared in the development of the capitalist system. These forms have existed in combination, but successive historical phases were marked by the dominance of one form and then the other, that is, by extensive surplus and then by intensive surplus. Footnote. Extensive surplus refers to absolute surplus value, and intensive surplus to relative surplus value. End footnote. Section 1.1.1. The production of extensive surplus. Let us call T the apparent duration of work or time of production, and Tn the time necessary for the reconstitution of labor power, and Tv abstract social labor time devoted to production. The application of labor power in the labor process as the process of valorization can be schematized as follows. So basically this is saying dividing so in capital, and like generally speaking, in when you're talking about capitalism, but I suppose you could say this about any mode of production, there's like necessary labor time and surplus labor time, right? And this chart kind of looks similar to that, right? So amongst the entirety of labor time, there's the time necessary for the reconstitution of labor power, which would be time devoted to the, which in capitalism would take the form of variable capital, right, wages, and then that the value produced that would return to wages. And then there's the value it's devoted to time, work duration that's devoted to surplus production. That's how it traditionally would be said. This one's kind of weird though because it has like a third space which isn't labeled, right? There's like a big, the time necessary for the reproduction of labor power and the abstract social labor time devoted to production, whatever that means in general. I don't know why that's smaller than the apparent duration of work or time of production. I don't know. Anyway, it's a weird graph. Let's see what it says, though. Surplus labor surplus is equal to the abstract social labor time devoted to production minus the time necessary for the reconstitution of labor power. The yield upon labor power would be abstract social labor time devoted to production minus the time necessary for the reconstitution of labor power divided by the time necessary for the reconstitution of labor power. The difference between So I kind of actually misdescribed this graph, actually. Hold on. There's the time necessary for reconstitution of labor power, and there's the abstract social labor time devoted to production. I feel like I made it sound like as if the abstract social labor time devoted to production corresponded to like surplus labor time, but it doesn't. It looks like it's something more corresponding to like living labor, right, which would constitute both the value added, the value that reconstitutes labor power or goes into the reproduction of labor power, and that which is surplus. The abstract labor time devoted to production is larger, constitutes greater space than includes time necessary for the reconstitution of labor power within it, as opposed to socially necessary labor time, which does not. So, anyway, the difference between the apparent duration of work or time of production and abstract social labor time devoted to production expresses a certain, quote, porosity, end quote, in the labor process as explained by Jesus E. Barola. Quote, the working day remained for a long time relatively porous, made up, of course, by some particularly intense periods, but also periods of inactivity. Parenthesis, for example, at the end of a labor process or when starting up again, or while maintenance work was going on, in parenthesis, it is in the nature of machinery to systematically eliminate porosity, end quote. So I guess that means just like gaps in production time during production time, I guess. That's what's being referred to here. The introduction of machinery has its initial object the intensification of work, parenthesis, increase of abstract social labor time devoted to production, in parenthesis, rather than the augmentation of productivity by lowering the time necessary for the reconstitution of labor power. Just a side note, there's this notion of porosity, or this porousness of production is very interesting, and the idea of like this quote here that says, it is in the nature of machinery to systematically eliminate porosity, right? And you can kind of think of like that is what like Taylorism is, right? Or like the concept of Taylorism, whether or not it was like fully applied or generalized in any serious capacity. The imperative of Taylorism was to like remove any kind of gaps in the production process, to economize to like micromanage the labor activity in order to eliminate any kind of like gaps that were viewed as unnecessary in work, right? To like streamline production and make it maximally efficient. So that's a very interesting thing, this elimination of porosity. That's very interesting. The time, or total the apparent duration of work or time of production minus abstract social labor time devoted to production expended by labor power without creating any surplus cannot be separated from the production of this surplus and from the organization of the labor process. Any change in the conditions of production seeks to transform the labor process in order to expand the yield of labor power, i.e. the rate of surplus. This can be done by lowering the time necessary for the reconstitution of labor power or increasing abstract social labor time devoted to production, either without changing the relation of abstract social labor time devoted to production to the apparent duration of work or time of production, parenthesis, i.e. by prolonging the apparent duration of work or time of production, which involves prolonging abstract social labor time devoted to production, in parenthesis, or by changing the relation of the abstract social labor time devoted to production to the apparent duration of work or time of production, in parenthesis. Lowering the time necessary to reproduce labor power, I should say what he says reconstitute labor power, represents the method of production of an intensive surplus, whereas increasing abstract social labor time devoted to production represents the method of producing an extensive surplus. Historically, the production of surplus as extensive surplus was achieved by extending the apparent duration of work, notably in the first half of the 19th century. Given the organization of the working class and the result of the class struggle over time, changes in the conditions of production no longer take the form fundamentally of a prolongation of the apparent duration of work. The dominant form of production of extensive surplus today is achieved by changes in the relation between TV and T, in the direction of an increase in T. Let me repeat that. The dominant form of production of extensive surplus today is achieved by changes in the relation between abstract social labor time devoted to production and the apparent duration of work or time of production. In the direction of an increase in the social abstract social time devoted to production, divided by the apparent total labor time. The way in which the labor process is organized to achieve such a result takes the form of an intensification of work. The way in which the labor process is organized to achieve such a result takes the form of an intensification of work, in which it is a question of subordinating labor powers to the more or less continuous movement of systems of machinery. Subordinating labor powers to the more or less continuous movement of machinery, either by Fordist organization of mass production and its contemporary developments, recomposition of industrial work, or by automated mass production, although today the organization of the labor process is evolving towards a combination of these two main forms of the organization of production. The intensification of work involves reducing the amount of time during which labor power produces no value. Footnote, see Michel Aglietta. Quote, acceleration in the work speed of each worker is connected with the simplification of the precise work movements he has to perform and to a better coordination of the work by the collectivity of workers, end quote. Michel Aglietta. End footnote. It thus promotes the production of an extensive surplus. But this form of production of an extensive surplus, linked to mass production, is necessarily related to the production of an intensive surplus. Nonetheless, the limits to the production of an extensive surplus are determined by the resistance of the working class to the intensification of the rhythms of work. Section 1.1.2 The production of intensive surplus. In a fully developed capitalist mode of production of intensive surplus by lowering the labor time needed to reconstitute labor power depends basically upon the production of commodities by the department of consumption goods destined for the maintenance of labor power, and hence depends on the relationship within the process of accumulation of capital between the departments producing production goods and consumption goods. This involves, therefore, increasing the productivity of labor by developing the productive forces, mechanization of work, with an ensuing increase in the organic composition of capital, and everything which follows from that for the mechanisms of accumulation and the relations between the means of production department and the means of consumption department. In fact, economies in labor power entering production, reduction of the time necessary for the reproduction of labor power, are reflected in the rise in the organic composition of capital, which is expressed in changes in technical composition. This in turn promotes the need to produce material means of production and gives rise to the predominance of the means of production department. But the department producing consumption goods is alone directly responsible for the maintenance of labor power, and it was therefore necessary for the capitalist system to develop, albeit with an uneven development, the department producing consumption goods, and ensuing contradictions arising between the means of production department and the means of consumption department. Mass consumption paradoxically is intimately connected to economies in the use of surplus power. Mass consumption paradoxically is intimately connected to economies in the use of labor power, lowering of necessary labor time, or the time reproducing the worker, for the production of intensive surplus. This has forced capitalism to opt in a decisive manner for this method of producing surplus, with all the consequences that have followed both for the accumulation in means of production and for the accumulation in means of consumption, and hence today an exemplary crisis of accumulation arising from the uneven development of the departments of production. Section 1.2 Different labor processes as landmarks in the history of capitalism. The first two forms, cooperation and manufacture, characterize the labor process at the time of the transition from feudalism to capitalism. Only with mechanization and automation was the labor process fully integrated into the capitalist organization of the productive system and into the movement of capital. Section 1.2.1 Cooperation, simple, M. Freycinet, provides the following definition, quote, the bringing together by an owner of capital of artisans deprived of their means of production, but whose labor power retains its value. The worker loses control of the production process, ... end quote. M. Freycinet. That's a Michel Freycinet, if I'm pronouncing the last name right. The principle of cooperation lies in the coordination of labor processes based upon crafts. The principle of cooperation lies in the coordination of labor processes based upon crafts. Quote, craft, end quote, here being given both a social and technical definition, end parenthesis. Who takes into his own hands the power to select and design particular use values. This coordination of labor processes based upon crafts reproduces in a modified way the hierarchical productive organization of artisanal production, characterized by the relationship between the master craftsman and journeyman, the primary relationship, and between apprentice and adult workers, the secondary relationship, Cooperation, a transitional labor process, existed within the framework of petty commodity production. From the point of view of labor power, cooperation opens the way to, but only opens the way to, the formation of the collective worker, in which each individual labor is merely part of the whole and is a function of social labor time, concrete labor / abstract labor, In this form, of the labor process, however, we are only at the first stage of the social existence of concrete labor, the basis of craft production. Section 1.2.2 Manufacture, or advanced cooperation, The principle of manufacture amounts to an extension of the principle of simple cooperation, with an initial dissolution of the preceding labor process based upon crafts. Simple cooperation is effectively a juxtaposition and coordination of labor processes based upon crafts, which do not in fact change the processes themselves. With manufacturing, the various work activities centered upon the crafts are decomposed and reorganized, thus introducing a division of labor and fragmentation of tasks, even though the craft remains the foundation of the work. In this process, various kinds of work, based upon the old crafts but now reorganized, become interdependent, and from this there arises the collective worker, to whom the individual worker becomes subordinated. The artisan becomes a worker, with profound ensuing effects on social relationships arising from the process of technical dequalification and hyperqualification of labor power within manufacture as a result of the fragmentation of tasks. I'm going to repeat that sentence. The artisan becomes a worker, with profound ensuing effects on social relationships arising from a process of technical dequalification and hyperqualification of labor power within manufacture as a result of the fragmentation of tasks. This process of dequalification / hyperqualification within manufacture is described by M. Freycinet as 1. The beginning of the, quote, de-skilling, end quote, of the work of the majority. This is brought about by reducing the field in which the worker's skills can be used and developed, progressively suppressing that part of the worker's activity which consists of preparing and organizing the work on the worker's own way, eliminating the worker's understanding of the whole of the labor process, and as a result eliminating the worker's concrete control of the labor process. 2. The beginning of hyperqualification of a small minority. At this stage of development, the activity is appropriated from the worker, whether by reducing the scope of the worker's work or by taking away the worker's direct control of the organization of work, are transferred by the capitalist to a small number of wage earners who are themselves divided into different categories and subject to the capitalist's control. The responsibilities of these groups of workers are A. to systematize the fragmentation of work, B. to adapt each tool which previously was used for many purposes to new narrower uses in such a way as to increase their efficiency, end quote. And that's from Michel Freycinet. Footnote. Oh, no footnote. This decomposition and recomposition of craft-based work is fundamentally aimed at increasing the surplus, by creating a greater intensity of work, (a first form, more mercantile than capitalist, of extensive surplus), end parenthesis. I'm going to repeat that. (, a first form, more mercantile than capitalist, of extensive surplus), end parenthesis. This increase in the intensity of work is obtained by turning essentially craft-based labor powers into collective labor. This increase in the intensity of work is obtained by turning essentially craft-based labor powers into collective labor, thus recomposing, reorganizing, quote, hierarchizing, end quote, individual labor processes which are henceforth fragmented and the social yield of which is driven to the maximum, given the level of productive forces, tools, skills, end parenthesis. But manufacture comes up against not only the narrowness of manufacture's productive base, but also and above all against the contradictory process of the reproduction of labor power, which remains organized around crafts, so that it is still necessary for there to be a broad stratum of skilled workers, prolonged training, apprenticeship, end parenthesis. The autonomy of this stratum of artisans, who have become manufacturing workers but whose social origin is that of the old crafts and trades, end parenthesis. All this at a time when it is simultaneously necessary to devalue his labor power, now the process of fragmentation and dequalification are underway. This is ultimately achieved by the introduction of machinery and the modern factory. Section 1.2.3. The collective worker, mechanization and the factory. Within the factory and mechanization, the two weaknesses of manufacture from the point of view of capital were partially overcome by enlarging the productive base, eroding the autonomy of the reproduction of labor power, which henceforth was subjected to capital. Application of the principle of mechanization in the factory substituted the concept of the machine for that of the tool. The machine is composed of three basic elements: the motor, or mechanical source of power, end parenthesis, the transmission, the operating equipment, various tools, end parenthesis. By mechanization is meant the operation of several tools, now independent of the worker's manual dexterity, end parenthesis, by means of transmission mechanisms, in place of human energy, in other words, powered by a mechanical source. By mechanization is meant the operation of several tools, now independent of the worker's manual dexterity, end parenthesis, by means of transmission mechanisms, in place of human energy, in other words, powered by a mechanical source. The tool integrated into the system of machinery becomes a, quote, machine tool, end quote, a machine which incorporates social relations. Machinery is not neutral because the machine incorporates in the machine's mode of operation the dexterity and skill of the individual worker, who is henceforth deprived of his skill and subordinated, from the point of view of social production, to the machine, which he can only serve, set in motion, and regulate. Quote, what we wish to show, on the contrary, is that the very design of machines is determined by the capitalist use to which the machines are put. In other words, by the mode of exploitation of labor power. The separation of the mental from the manual part of work is materialized in the machines themselves, and appears to the workers as an intangible external force. End quote. Michel Freycinet. Footnote. See Michel Freycinet. On the same scene, see Stéphane Marglin. Origine et fonction de la parcellisation des tech. I don't know if I'm saying that right. In the edited volume by André Gorge, Critique de la division du travail. which is translated as the division of labor, the labor process, and the class struggle in modern capitalism. Quote, "It was not the steam engine which gave us capitalism. It was capitalism which gave us the steam engine," end quote. And that's one of the main things you see in, and this is like a general thing that's in like political Marxism too. There's kind of, I think in like a lot of traditional Marxism where there was this kind of like technological determinism, indeed a technological reductionism, which reduced social development to technological development. And this started to be bucked against big time in the 1970s. This is especially important in things like, when you, especially people who take seriously the notion of like the labor process being subsumed under capital, whether that be a lot of the people that there's a separate volume called Contribution to the Critique of Technology, or Critique of Technology, which is like a bunch of Marxist critiques of technology that I have on this channel. But people like that, but also in like political Marxism, right? The rendering of what's the word? What am I looking for? The rendering of say agriculture in England. It's making the agricultural production market dependent in England, fundamentally increased productivity in agriculture, which gave rise to a whole list of inventions and improvements, such as the Jethro Tull for the sowing of seeds, right? These social relations fundamentally give rise to technologies and not the other way around, or at least the diffusion of certain technologies. I should say that's probably more specific. What was I gonna say? I had an idea here. Oh yeah, so yeah, that's just like there's like a generally, like the reason that this quote is put up here, that is included in this footnote, I'm assuming, this quote that says, "It was not the steam engine which gave us capitalism, it was capitalism which gave us the steam engine." That's like a push back against technological determinism or reductionism. Anyway, capitalist development of machinery in the factory contributes on the one hand to a massive, quote, de-skilling, end quote, of production workers, together with a loss of autonomy in the reproduction of labor power, and on the other hand, a, quote, overskilling, end quote, of a small number of workers responsible for innovation, organization, regulation, and repair. This process of dequalification and hyperqualification is henceforth characteristic of the practical forms of the reproduction of labor power. Machinery in its capitalist use has as its essential object the growth of surplus on an extensive basis. Increase of intensity, by integrating the reproduction of labor power ever more tightly to the processes of valorization and accumulation of capital. In relation to the forms of appearance of surplus, mechanization leads to an important increase in the intensity of work by increasing the abstract social labor time devoted to production, so that the collective worker becomes an ever greater obstacle to the freedom on maneuver of the individual worker. In this way, the production of an extensive surplus has, as the production of an extensive surplus's corollary, a drastic fragmentation of tasks, which are coordinated in an authoritarian and hierarchical manner into collective work. This fragmentation is matched by a dequalification of labor power and by the loss of labor power's control over its own training and reproduction. Labor power becomes exclusively a, quote, commodity compelled to sell itself. I have a piece on here, actually, that just brought to mind, is that there's a piece on here that just came to mind by Paresh Chattopadhyay, which is about bureaucracy, the concept of bureaucracy in Marx. And the interesting thing that he talks about, which is very interesting, is because a lot of times when people in like especially in relation to the Soviet experience, especially in like a lot of like the mainstream anti-Stalinism, or like the main courses of anti-Stalinism, which I say would assume would be probably pretty much dominated by Trotskyism. Um, actually, oh no, actually, that's probably not accurate. But a lot of it, in a lot of Marxist discourse, or a lot of Marxist theorizing, since Marx's time, has usually focused on, when it's talked about bureaucracy, has usually talked about like state bureaucracy, while taking bureaucracy within production almost for granted, if not a good thing, right? And you can find, I don't have them on hand, but you can find a lot of quotes from people like Trotsky and Lenin, who like really focus on, who really think that, who really completely approach bureaucratization within production, within the economy, like bureaucracy not just being a state factor, but like an economic factor, approaching that, like not even recognizing it, or if to the extent that they do recognize it, viewing it as a social good, right? And so like it's a very interesting thing in Chattopadhyay's article, insofar as he talks about like how Marx, in his theory, especially in this part of Capital, on like the labor process, especially in Capital Volume 1, right, the despotism of the internal division of labor of the factory, makes a lot about, there's a lot, or at least in like in Capital and elsewhere, there's a lot on like bureaucratization and hierarchy in work. It has it given a way more of a critical look than in a lot of Marx's a lot of Marx reception, which I think is super interesting. Like in traditional Marxism, right? There's a kind of like a and there's ambivalences in Marx and especially in Engels, right? That thing that tankies love to cite about like on authority or whatever. There's different there's some ambiguities on this, but there's definitely like a very strong critique of a critique of bureaucracy in the labor process in Marx, which is not was not particularly appreciated by a lot of his like early 20th century followers. Anyway, moving on. Simultaneously, mechanization, in substituting dead labor for living labor, parenthesis, although still requiring the latter for setting machines in motion, supplying raw material maintenance, in parenthesis, improves the productivity of labor by lowering the value of labor power. Or the time that goes into the reconstitution of labor power. Well, it doesn't say that, but I'm saying that because it has like the symbol that it had before for the amount of time within the overall working time that goes to the reproduction of labor power. Quote, de-skilling and devaluation of labor power complement each other in a mechanism of production and reproduction which is henceforth more fully subject to the production of extensive and intensive surplus, or in other words, subjected to capital. The management of labor power becomes a capitalist imperative. Only at the beginning of the 20th century did mechanization culminate as a means of subjecting the labor process to capital, in Taylorism and Fordism, in which the elements of the labor process are completely taken apart and recoordinated as assembly line work. Recoordinated at assembly line work, including the first forms of automation. The principal result of mechanization, arising from the accelerated, quote, de-skilling, end quote, of the worker, appears in a new type of worker, the unskilled assembly line worker, who is the product of the capitalist division of labor. Section 1.2.4 The collective worker and automation. In mechanized production, the worker at the machine is surrounded by many other necessary operations, such as setting up the job, feeding the machine, regulating the machine's operation, and checking the product. Therefore, a worker can only serve a limited number of machines. This gives rise to certain, quote, porosity, end quote, in the utilization of machines, porousness, like we were talking about before, and in the degree of coordination between different machines within the whole mechanized system, which affects the rate of profit. Automation, in automation's capitalist use, aims to eliminate all manual intervention by the worker by means of electronic techniques, so that workers' intervention is now limited to overall supervision and control. By integrating machinery into a machine system which eliminates this, quote, porosity, end quote, automation ensures the maximum turnover of capital for the production of an intensive surplus, while carrying the, quote, dequalification, end quote, of productive labor to its most extreme point. If we are to produce a precise analysis of the consequences of automation for the labor process, we must distinguish between automation applied A, in discontinuous form, in the production of production goods and consumer durables by mechanical means, and B, in continuous form, in the production of intermediate goods, steel, petrochemicals, energy, by a physico-chemical transformation. If we are to produce a precise analysis of the consequences of automation for the labor process, we must distinguish between automation applied A, in discontinuous form, in the production of production goods and consumer durables by mechanical means, B, in continuous form, in the production of intermediate goods, steel, petrochemicals, chemicals, energy, by a physico-chemical transformation. A, discontinuous. In mechanical and electromechanical processes, one can discern two sorts of application of automation to the departments of production and consumption goods, involving on the one hand generalization of mechanical transfer machinery for mass production, and on the other the general use of numerical control machines for production in small and medium series. Mechanical transfer reduces a series of machine tools carrying out a series of specialized operations to one automated whole. The movement of the unfinished product from one machine tool to another is performed automatically, without it ever having to be taken off and remounted for each operation. The whole constitutes a flow line. Thus flow lines are connected to each other by automatic conveyors, which thus act as a depository for unfinished products. Transfer machinery, which was first developed in the automobile industry, has been introduced into many areas of production linked to mass production. Transfer machinery, which was first developed in the automobile industry, has been introduced into many areas of production linked to mass production. Numerical control machines automate the different phases of production, even in some cases setting up the work and quality control, in the production of small or medium series of mechanical components. The numerical control device is a machine tool in which the series of movements necessary to the working of the machine is directed and controlled by a predetermined program instead of by the operator. This type of machine tool, though it involves less use of manpower, at the same time reduces even more the technical skills of the worker to the extent that the skills themselves increasingly disappear. The new manpower needs associated with numerical control machines include engineers trained in numerical control, programs and multi-purpose electrical and mechanical maintenance personnel. Labor power skilled in mechanical operations is replaced by labor power concerned with programming control, qualified in electronics. There's a chart here which I don't really think I can explain very well. Yeah. I'm not even going to try. The high degree of training required for these operations of supervision and control. This is a footnote. Footnote. The notation in this diagram is based on a very approximate translation from the French classification HS, highly skilled worker, S, skilled worker, US, unskilled worker. The OS category includes all of those working directly on an assembly line, including semi-skilled workers. The OP category includes those with some degree of technical engineering or administrative training or qualification. End footnote. Footnote. The high degree of training required for these operations of supervision and control has allowed some to argue, somewhat theologically, that, quote, the prospects for small series production in the next 10 years are astonishing. The shop floor worker will become much more rare than the machine tool minder or the trained maintenance engineer, end quote. Renaud in Dedal, 1975. End footnote. Machine tools already ensured the rise of the unskilled and semi-skilled worker, i.e. machine tools produce the, quote, dequalification, end quote, of workers. Automation using transfer machines and then numerical control machines make the unskilled worker the norm. They generalize the disintegration of working activity and the fragmentation of tasks. Footnote. See Lucien Nouvelle, June 1975, quote, for small series production, numerical control also gives a solution to the problem of highly trained manpower, which more and more difficult to recruit in the engineering industry. One can, in fact, obtain the required degree of precision through using operators with a level of training less than would be needed for conventional machine tools, end quote. End footnote. By the discontinuous character of production, we mean, on the one hand, automatic production of large series of components, on the other, fitting and assembling these components. By the discontinuous character of production, we mean, on the one hand, automatic production of large series of components, on the other, fitting and assembling these components. Capitalist utilization of the principle of automation and the coordination of fitting and assembly operations, technologically possible in the future, probably, by means of assembly lines grouped and integrated into each other by automatic conveyors, would make possible the realization of continuous processes of mechanical transformation. At the present, however, entirely automated factories are only involved in the production of intermediary goods, in which the material transformations concerned are of a physico-chemical nature. B. Continuous. The application of the principle of automation to continuous production has only been developed in the production of intermediate goods. Steel, petrochemicals, cement, power stations, where a physico-chemical process of transformation rather than a mechanical process of transformation is predominant. The tendency is for the production unit to be simply an integrated and automated system in which the worker's functions are essentially limited to those of maintenance and overall control. The automated factory, press button factory, is geared in the automated factory's productive activities to mass production. Here, the dequalification of workers is extreme, even to the point of the complete disappearance of points in the process at which the worker has to intervene. Section 2. The complex forms of the organization of labor processes in contemporary capitalism. On the one hand, there is a labor process directed towards mass production, i.e. towards the production of intensive surplus, relative surplus value, i.e. the lowering of the exchange value of labor power. Alongside this, there is a labor process directed towards the reproduction of the hegemony of the dominant strata. A hegemony which is based on control of commodity relations, control of innovation and design, conception, of the realization of commodities, of the organization of production, of the management of labor power, etc. Section 2.1. Labor process and mass production. We must always keep in mind that the quote, technical quote, methods involved in the different labor processes, or methods of manufacture, have been progressively and historically formed by the conditions in which capital has been realized, by the mise en valeur of capital, and also by the processes whereby capital has been accumulated. These have been and remain the motive forces in the evolution of the labor process at this level, and can alone explain the changes that have taken place in that process in the different branches and departments of social production. It follows from this that one cannot say anything about the evolution of labor processes without putting forward a number of hypotheses, albeit implicit, about the changes which have taken place in the processes of valorization and accumulation of capital. Therefore, we must summarize briefly the general tendencies concerning the valorization and accumulation of capital, which it is possible to identify on the basis of a century of capitalist practice, tendencies which thereby have also affected the evolution of the labor process. Then one can go on to formulate certain hypotheses about the factors which might act upon these general tendencies in such a way as to modify them. A. For the last 100 years, the main elements characterizing the conditions of the valorization of capital have been related to the conditions of the reproduction of a dual labor market with, on the one hand, a relatively skilled workforce capable of bargaining high wage levels, but representing an ever-decreasing fraction of aggregate labor power. On the other hand, an unskilled workforce, drawn at the beginning from pre-capitalist modes of production, available for low or even very low wages. This dual labor market, found at first within advanced capitalist social formations, related to the conditions of valorization and accumulation, tends increasingly to be formed only at an international level. For example, in the U.S. at the end of the 19th century, the skilled workers with trade or craft training, together with those immigrants who had experience in trades union and political activities, engaged in a political struggle which was widespread enough to form an obstacle to the valorization and accumulation of capital. At the same time, there was arriving from Europe a mass of peasant immigrants who could not be incorporated just as they were into the process of production. Labor processes therefore had to be modified. On the one hand, labor processes had to be adapted so as to make possible the de-skilling of the quote, craft workers, and on the other hand, labor processes had to be adapted so as to allow the employment of workers who were unskilled or who could be very easily rendered unskilled. Taylorism and Fordism provided a solution. Taylorism and Fordism came up with a particular kind of labor process suitable for the employment of definite kinds of labor power. The reconstitution of this dual labor market, necessarily going together with two labor processes in constant interaction, is a necessity for the capitalist system, a necessity which is expressed, as regards the working class, in a double movement of capital: tendency to equalization, tendency to differentiation. The conditions of the reproduction of this dual labor market, historically connected with internal pre-capitalist forms of production in advanced countries, readily became established at the international level, and this has an effect on the process of internationalization and the international division of labor, i.e., it has an effect on the differences that become established throughout the world in respect of the conditions of production and reproduction of the working class. B. The dual labor market, together with new forms of valorization of capital, with the employment and production of new scientific knowledge, nuclear energy, cybernetics, automation, etc., with the large-scale use of new materials, 80% produced at the, quote, periphery, end quote, 80% consumed at the, quote, center, end parenthesis. All of these things taken together give rise to a mode of valorization of capital based on mass production. All of these things taken together give rise to a mode of valorization of capital based on mass production. Or to put it another way, on the, quote, large-scale production of surplus value, end quote, where this is extracted via products manufactured in very large numbers. Or to put it another way, on the, quote, large-scale production of surplus value, end quote, where this is extracted via products manufactured in very large numbers, end parenthesis. This mass production depends on the domination of capital. Capital no longer comes up against any technical limits to the scope and degree of capital's domination. The only limits are social limits. C. In the context of this dual labor market, the two main kinds of labor process take the following forms: as discontinuous processes, Taylorist and Fordist organization of labor, assembly line work, repetitive and fragmented work involving a large number of unskilled workers provided either by immigration from abroad or by internal transfers of labor, peasants, women workers, marginalized strata of the population, the automobile industry, electronics, electrical, household goods, traditional textiles, etc. As continuous processes. Automatic mass production, involving very large investment of constant, and fixed, capital. That's weird to say, and fixed capital. Fixed capital is part of constant capital. Anyway, involving very large investment of constant, and fixed, capital, and few, even very few workers. Some of these workers are relatively skilled, petrochemicals, chemicals, synthetic textiles, in the spheres of regulation and control, the others of whom are completely unskilled. D. It is possible to make certain observations concerning the location of these different labor processes. As far as Taylorist and Fordist assembly line organized processes are concerned, there have been historically two successive tendencies. In an earlier period, as a long rural expropriation continued in the central imperialist countries, the reproduction of the dual labor market was assured. The dual labor market was supplemented as the need arose by the importation of workers from the periphery, In this period, the imperialist countries retained manufacture and transformation of products within their own borders, only allowing underdeveloped countries the job of extraction of natural products, raw materials, energy, certain agricultural products, This international division of labor has reached its culmination in the 1970s. In a second period, the political and social preconditions for the reproduction of the labor market, in relation with the productive system, were no longer assured in the imperialist centers. The periphery begins to change in character as a result of a certain delocalization of the labor process and of the process of production. Certain kinds of manufacture are shifted, are located in underdeveloped social formations, with the imperialist centers reserving for themselves those processes which require some know-how, some technological knowledge, and a skilled labor force. The imperialist centers reserving for themselves those processes which require some know-how, some technological knowledge, and a skilled labor force. We can see, therefore, a growth in the imperialist centers of the, quote, brain power, end quote, industries, production, engineering, research, and development, while the peripheral countries rapidly take on a new specific character with the appearance of mass production industries (cars, domestic electrical appliances, transistor radios, cameras, textiles). For the automatic mass production, as for automatic mass production, this remains by and large located in the central imperialist countries or in certain intermediate countries, although this general tendency is complicated by certain factors, by the necessity for finance, nowadays petrodollars are involved, problems of pollution, petrochemicals, steel, the unavailability of sufficient skilled manpower, which threatens to prevent the process of redeployment on the scale envisaged in certain countries, e.g. France, E. We must emphasize that Fordism, which still characterizes the labor process today, is not the same as Taylorism. Fordism is a real innovation. As B. Coriat remarks, Ford took over the essential aspects of Taylorism, separation of design and innovation from execution, division and subdivision of jobs. Each movement allowed a specific time, but he also went further in introducing two further principles: a new method of control of labor power, the introduction of the flow line principle, conveyors, in the concrete shape of the assembly line. As for the assembly line, the innovations of Fordism can be summed up as follows. Quote, the flow of parts is as much as possible achieved by machines, conveyors, transporters, moving assembly frames, and is always separated from the work of assembly itself. The assembly workers, thus, have no need to move about the workshop and are tied to their work positions. A consequence of this is the fact that the speed of movement of the unfinished products, and therefore the work rate, is controlled mechanically, and not by the workers themselves, on whom it is imposed. The principles of Fordism give rise to two contradictory propositions. On the one hand, there is established a mechanical system based on the consistent movement and circulation of parts, tools, and materials. On the other hand, this whole circulation is designed so as to, quote, fix, unquote, the worker to the worker's position so that the worker never has to move a step away from it, end quote. It's from B. Coriat. As for the methods of control of labor, Ford introduced the day wage in place of piece rates . The famous, quote, $5 day, end quote, was a necessary addition to the new labor process. And the AI overview says, the $5 day refers to the historic wage increase implemented by Henry Ford on January 5, 1914 at the Ford Motor Company. Ford doubled the minimum daily wage for his workers to $5 an hour, an 8-hour day, aiming to boost worker morale and attract/retain employees. This move was a significant step in labor history, leading to increased worker purchasing power and in turn boosting demand for Ford's products. Back to the text. Without going into any detail, we can say that the $5 day had the function as a method of control of labor power, of, quote, assuring for capital an uninterrupted supply of labor power, preventing the occurrence of large-scale workers' rebellions, which had occurred regularly in 19th century Europe, by, quote, disinfecting, end quote, the working population and by training inspectors to control them, thereby assuring in the best conditions the rapid advance of mass production and of the accumulation of capital, end quote. This by an article or book by Sergio Bologna, P. Carpignano, and Antonio Negri. Crisi e Organizzazione Operaia. I don't know. An organization only is probably how to say it. Crisi e Organizzazione Operaia. Anyway, moving on. F. The processes of internationalization of capital and of production, the basis for the development of the multinational firms, gave rise on an ever-increasing scale to worldwide mass automatic production. Labor processes came to be definable only on an international scale, and hence there arises a new worker, viz. the mass worker, bound to the vicissitudes of the multinationals, i.e. to the movements of the internationalization of capital. Oh, sorry, that last quote was not from... Sorry, that last quote was from B. Quite Out, not from Bologna, Carpignano, and Negri. Sorry. New section. Section 2.2. The labor process and the control of commodity relations. The reproduction of capitalist relations of production takes the form of the production of, quote, commodities, end quote. The concept of the commodity is central to the capitalist system. The control of reproduction from the point of view of the hegemonic strata takes place via the control of the commodity. Not only in relation to the conditions of production of commodities, organization of the labor process in mass production, but also in the relation of the reproduction of commodity relations, parenthesis, i.e. the reproduction of the domination of the hegemonic strata, in parenthesis. Because of this necessity, the social process of commodity production is divided into three distinct stages, parenthesis, a division which is the source of growing contradiction, in parenthesis. The process of, quote, conception, end quote, of commodities, limited to design engineering firms, research departments, development firms. The process of, quote, production, end quote, of commodities, entailing a particular organization of the labor process for mass production. The process of, quote, realization, end quote, of commodities, via the act of circulation, entailing not only the productive activity of transportation, but specialized transport firms and departments. Commercial firms specializing in marketing, etc. It is interesting to note that the field of production design engineering is recognized in the professional literature as being an outcome of Taylorism and Fordism, parenthesis, i.e. the production of the capitalist development of the labor process, with ever-increasing subdivision of work, in parenthesis. Quote, under the influence of Taylorism, there began to appear, between the two world wars, the practice of selling technological know-how and the negotiation of contracts for the sale of, quote, turnkey, end quote, factories. One second. An AI overview says a turnkey factory is a manufacturing facility where the entire production process from design to finished product delivery is managed by a single contractor or vendor. This means the client doesn't need to coordinate with multiple companies for different stages of the process, simplifying the workflow and potentially reducing lead times. Back to the text. Quote, under the influence of Taylorism, there began to appear between the two world wars the practice of selling technological know-how and the negotiation of contracts for the sale of, quote, turnkey, end quote, factories. Production designers began by teaching factory managers how to cut down on the time taken by the various movements of the workers, and then how to lay out the machines in the shop. From there, they went on in the search for greater efficiency to pen and paper studies on the construction of whole factories starting from scratch. After the Second World War, countries which needed to reconstruct and those in the process of development began to order whole industries, end quote. And that's from some article in French from a newspaper. The commodity control of the reproduction of the relations of production is decisively located at the stages of conception and realization. The commodity control of the reproduction of the relations of production is decisively located at the stages of conception and realization. Which has led to a development of the capitalist system towards a so-called, quote, tertiarization of the economy. The AI overview says tertiarization refers to the shift from the primary and secondary sectors, agriculture and manufacturing, to the tertiary sector, services within an economy. This process involves a growing proportion of the economy's resources, labor, and value added being allocated to service-based industries. Back to the text. But the significance of this famous, quote, tertiarization, end quote, can only be grasped in relation to the demands of the class struggle from the standpoint of the hegemonic strata. In fact, confronted with an increase in the intensity of the class struggle of the proletariat in production, with no economic or political solution to this struggle available to the ruling capitalist strata, traditional class alliances were endangered. It was essential that the hegemony of capitalist domination could be exercised not only through commodity control, parenthesis, conception and realization, in parenthesis, but that also new social strata be brought into class alliances. But also new social strata be brought into class alliances. By broadening those strata in society that could be brought to function ideologically within the ruling, quote, historical bloc, unquote. See Gramsci prison notebooks for this concept. The AI overview says a, quote, historical bloc, end quote, is a concept developed by Antonio Gramsci, particularly in his prison notebooks, to describe the ways in which various social forces, parenthesis, classes, groups, institutions, in parenthesis, unite to shape and maintain a particular hegemonic structure. The historical bloc is not just about social alliances, but also about the articulation of ideas, values, and practices that underpin a dominant social order. Back to the text. Tertiarization gives rise to those famous white-collar workers who have been so much misunderstood by the unfortunate S. Millay and so many other sociologists, i.e. designers, administrative staff, technologists, research staff, etc., who take part in the commodity reproduction of the capitalist system, i.e. in the reproduction of the hegemonic strata of the bourgeoisie, use them in order to disguise the contradictions that develop at the level of production and of the organization of the labor process of mass production. The capitalist system conducts a massive ideological offensive in order to mold these workers into the logic of commodity reproduction. The capitalist system conducts a massive ideological offensive in order to mold these workers into the logic of commodity reproduction, with, for example, business schools, management institutes, the mystique of computers, and so on. Nevertheless, capitalism is forced to organize the labor process of commodity production in the only way suited to it, with a hierarchical system and with fragmentation of the work of conception and realization. The same organization of the labor process of the mass production of commodities gradually takes over the labor processes of conception and realization of commodities, even though a growing burden of ideology, together with the specific aspects of the production of particular kinds of labor power involved in these processes, have an influence in determining class relations within the so-called tertiary spheres. The recent French bank strike against the organization of work testifies to the crisis in the reproduction of capitalist relations of production from the central point of view of commodity reproduction. M. Bell and J. Perrin have noted the growing complexity of the division of labor in design and production engineering. Quote, "We can see, therefore, that design and production engineering, inasmuch as it is an autonomous function of conception and of the realization of investments, reflects one of the process of the division of labor which is at work in the present time. But we must emphasize that this process of the division of labor is becoming more complex and that it is developing in a nonlinear fashion." End quote. M. Bell and J. Perrin. Nevertheless, this is reflected in the deskilling of a large proportion of workers and the hyperskilling of a small number. Nevertheless, it is necessary to take note of the much advertised moves of the bourgeoisie, simultaneously political and economic, whereby they have relaxed control to some extent over the production of commodities while maintaining their hegemonic strata. There is a risk that demands for workers' control, or self-management, autogestion, might prove illusory if they are limited to demands for control of production and do not confront head-on the control of commodity reproduction. The problem of the distinct stages, conception, production, realization, of commodity production, raises the question of the analysis of productive and unproductive labor. Because they fail to grasp the existence of these two distinct labor processes, the one centered on the production of a surplus product via mass production, the other centered on the capitalist control of the reproduction of commodity relations, certain writers, Stéphane Marglin et André Gors, Dominique Pignon, Jean Querzola, etc., have attempted to argue that the fragmentation and subdivision of work have nothing to do with the extraction of a surplus, but are fully explained by reference to class domination, to the reproduction of hegemonic strata. Quote, "The fragmentation and specialization of work, the separation of intellectual and manual labor, the monopolization of science by elites, the gigantism of plant and the centralization of power which is its result. None of this is necessary for efficient production. These things are necessary rather for the perpetuation of the domination of capital. End quote. André Gorz. Gorz also says, quote, technical and scientific workers have at the very center of their technical role the role also of reproducing the conditions and forms of the domination of capital over labor. End quote. End footnote. Control of commodity, perpetuation of the domination of capital, of course, parenthesis, by means of the control of commodity relations, in parenthesis. But this takes place via the production of a surplus product, i.e. by the development of the conditions of production and the inevitable revolutionizing of the labor process in the context of mass production. A further revolutionizing of the labor process appears at first sight to be involved in various, quote, job enrichment, end quote, schemes, both in industrial production, parenthesis, recomposition of industrial work, end parenthesis, and in the service sector, parenthesis, by, quote, job motivation, end quote, end parenthesis. New section, section 2.3, the problem of job enrichment, neo-Fordism. The critique of Taylorism and Fordism, a critique which often follows in the wake of political struggles in which the present organization of work is called into question, has developed a great deal since the pioneering works of J. Friedman. George Friedman. The critique by and large takes the following form. Quote, the scientific organization of labor leads to the introduction of flow-line work, of which assembly-line work is the most restricting form. Such work involves no intelligence, responsibility, or creativity, is a source of dissatisfaction and of degradation of the personality. The price paid is a high rate of absenteeism and of turnover, a large amount of wastage and of rejects, and an increase in stoppages and sabotage. The contradictions of fragmented work are the more acute as the worker's level of education increases. End quote. Claude Durand. This way of formulating the problem, however, misses both the theme of exploitation and that of the reproduction of the hegemonic strata. It calls Taylorism and Fordism into question only from a humanist standpoint, parenthesis, work involving no intelligence, responsibility, or creativity, source of dissatisfaction of degradation of the personality, end quote. And parenthesis, and it notes their effects only on the profitability of capital, parenthesis, high rates of absenteeism, turnover / wastage / rejects / sabotage, end parenthesis. Hence the question, is not job enrichment an adaptation of Taylorism and Fordism to new conditions of struggle and production, with the aim of preserving the profitability of capital, rather than a radical revolution of the labor process? Hence the question, is not job enrichment an adaptation of Taylorism and Fordism to new conditions of struggle and production, with the aim of preserving the profitability of capital, rather than a radical revolution of the labor process? By job enrichment is meant a change in the labor process which calls Taylorism and Fordism into question in relation to the fragmentation of this work. This involves both the regroupings of several work operations of the same basic kind as before, but now with greater variety of each workstation, parenthesis, instead of the very small number of operations at each workstation on a typical assembly line, in parenthesis, as to increase the duration of the work unit, parenthesis, from 1/2 or more than 15 minutes. As from 1/2 to more than 15 minutes, and parenthesis, and also allowing the workers themselves to monitor their own work, parenthesis, They take over a limited number of operations of regulation, quality control, and maintenance, in parentheses. Job enrichment would lead to the abolition of the assembly line. Experiments also along these lines have been conducted in the USA in some large multinational firms, such as Texas Instruments, Polaroid, Corning Glass, IBM, Chrysler, Ford, and General Motors. In Europe, they have been tried at, for example, Volvo, ICI, Philips, Olivetti, and Fiat. Semi-autonomous groups are only an extension of the idea of job enrichment, in which small work teams are free to organize and plan their own work, free, it need hardly be said, only within the limits established by the general production quotas. In a rather subtle analysis, Maurice de Montmollin has unmasked the basis of job enrichment. It is a neo-Taylorism rather than an anti-Taylorism, with the ideological function of enabling Taylorism and Fordism to survive in new conditions of control of labor power. Parenthesis, in particular, new conditions of control and of a dual labor market. Parenthesis, in particular, new conditions of control of a dual labor market. In parenthesis. Quote, this movement must be given a new name. With the important exception of semi-autonomous groups, anti-Taylorism is in fact neo-Taylorism. Quote, why is it only now that this movement has appeared? In fact, it is not a new movement, because neo-Taylorism is in effect the response of Taylorism to new conditions of the labor market, but it is not, in reality, such a reality. It is an interesting adaptation, but it does not do away with the older methods of organization. Its sudden appearance is thus not as sudden as all that. It has not the profound antecedents of a revolution, preceded for a long time by submerged tensions. But it appears on the scene as the calm and opportune development of a reform. End quote. Maurice de Montmollin. Taylorisme et anti-Taylorisme. And footnote. In fact, job recomposition never really calls the division of labor into question, parenthesis, intellectual and manual labor hierarchy, because it builds into the functioning of the small work groups that the fact that they are a subordinate part of the collective workers. As for semi-autonomous groups, a study by P. Bernoux and J. Louthier could only come to the conclusion that, quote, it appears that we must make a distinction between those groups of workers who are aware that they sell their labor power on condition that they show passive obedience to the firm, and those who experience this simply as an exchange, the product of their labor for a price, in parentheses. For while the former semi-autonomous groups may result in yet additional alienation, parentheses, inasmuch as they require even further commitment to work which remains, when all is said and done, repetitive and monotonous, in parentheses. For the latter semi-autonomous groups can give more meaning to work in that they make it possible to recover some sense of conscious activity of production. However, it seems that whatever may be the case as regards feelings of alienation or other of these kinds of groups, for either of these kinds of groups, the notion of exploitation, both as an objective reality and as the way the producers represent things to themselves, remain quite unchanged. End quote. For example, in the car industry, job recomposition is no more than an adaptation of Fordism based on the new methods of organizing the flow of components and unfinished products, as has been emphasized by Yves de Brost in relation to the example of Renault. Quote, In the 1970s, the overhead track has been divided into sections. Sublines have been built along the length of the train line so that engines and gearboxes can be disconnected from the line and held at this workstation. Thus, the engines and gearboxes are carried along the line, disengaged at the sub-assembly points where the various assembly operations are performed, and then replaced by the worker on the main line who carries them to another work point. On these subloops, therefore, there are several engines or gearboxes awaiting attention. The worker himself controlling the rhythm of the various operations that he has to perform. Thus one finds a variety of line arrangements in different departments of Renault and Fiat, with a variety of techniques for transporting the work to the work points, of supplying buffer stocks, and of organizing the different aspects of the work. Workers divide into subgroups, have a choice as to whether each member performs all the different assembly operations on an engine. Quote, innovations such as these have been... Workers divided into subgroups have a choice as to whether each member performs all the different assembly operations on an engine, or whether each of them performs specified tasks. Quote, I think this is a continuation of the quote. Innovations such as these have been made at the Termoli engine factory, the Cléon gearbox factory, the Duvrin engine factory, at Le Mans, in a workshop for assembly suspension systems. Job enlargement experiments started in 1972 resulted in the duration of the unit work cycle being increased to 15 minutes, and the experiment is to be extended to the whole workshop, end quote. Yves Debost. At the Volvo factory in Kalmar, the job recomposition experiment is based on the use of new types of wagon, substituting for the assembly line for the assembly of the Volvo 164. Quote, the wagons, perform three functions at the same time. The wagons convey information to the factories from computers. The wagons transport bodies and chassis. Workbenches are mounted on the wagons. End quote. Le Monde, June 19th, 1974. Industrial job recomposition and enrichment seems to be, then, only an adaptation of labor processes in mass production, Taylorism and Fordism, to new conditions of control of labor power, to new conditions of reproduction of the domination of capital in relation to the conditions for the production of the surplus product, and constitute a new capitalist practice, neo-Fordism. Neo-Fordism amounts to a purely formal attempt to abolish the collective worker, taking into consideration the social tensions which necessitate the setting up of an absolute despotism in the coordination of the labor processes based on automation, of several groups of workers, autonomous and imperious, but which are in reality forced to submit to the logic of the collective worker. And that's the end of the piece. Thank you so much for listening.